Today we move into the crime area of biological weapons. We're talking about the Anthrax Attacks of 2001. On October 2nd of 2001, Robert Stevens, a photojournalist for The Sun, fell ill with what appeared to be a flu-like sickness. He was taken to the hospital, and 3 days later, he died. During his time in the hospital, it was found out he had exposure to anthrax, and that's what ultimately led to his death. Bob Stevens was among 5 who actually died from the anthrax attacks, and there were also 17 other people sickened, and there were letters sent to Senator Tom Daschle office where one of the U.S. Senate buildings had to be evacuated, and there was also a letter sent to Tom Brokaw, a very prominent TV journalist from NBC. Neither of those, neither Senator DeLuche or Tom Brokaw were exposed to the virus. They never did end up receiving the letters. Their staff had opened it. And October 2nd, we're looking at about 3 weeks after 9/11. And people were terrified. They were already terrified of more other terrorist attacks. And now all of a sudden, in 2001, 5 people were killed simply just opening their mail and uncovering and breathing in anthrax. Anthrax is a chemical. It's a substance that inhaled is extremely deadly. Now, in the video, I'm going to kind of go over some of these science things that I'm not really an expert in, but I'll do my best. But I'm not Walter White. And police, law enforcement, the U.S. Postal Service people were terrified. FBI was running around trying to catch someone. This was also, the U.S. was prepared to go to Afghanistan. People didn't know if these attacks were done by Al-Qaeda, by a terrorist group, or was it just a lone wolf? The problem with these attacks, too, is it's almost untraceable. It's very hard to find out who did this. Really, one of the only things you know is that anthrax is really hard to get and to use as a weapon. Throughout 7 weeks, starting October 2nd, though, there were several news organizations and even the U.S. Capitol Office got letters containing anthrax. And they had to be cleaned out, obviously, and it appeared that whoever was doing this was also was mainly targeting people in the media and the government. And they had this letter, which you can see here. There's not a lot of information, but it looks like it would be something a terrorist would send out. And the FBI initially zeroed in on this guy, Stephen Hatfield, and he fought these accusations very vigorously. And the FBI they searched his house. I even think they drained a lake to see if they could find anything with Dr. Hatfield, Stephen Hatfield, but there was no connection that he could have possibly done something like this. And the reason the FBI thought Stephen Hatfield was the prime suspect were from a New York Times article from Nicholas Kristof of the New York Times titled "Profile of a Killer."
I want to look my fellow Americans directly in the eye and declare to them, I am not the anthrax killer. I know nothing about the anthrax attacks. I had absolutely nothing to do with this terrible crime.
And then essentially he eventually withstood the pressure from the FBI, and the FBI and bioweapons experts in the country basically went to try to decipher the anthrax by finding its actual genetic making. And it took around 6 years for that to come up. And then when they did the genetic makeup, it appeared that it pointed to a specific strain that was connected to Bruce Ivan, who was out of Fort Detrick, He was a biological weapons expert, very brilliant. He had the credentials in medicine to study this, and he worked for a very high-level defense lab in the United States, and they believe that that specific strain was connected to a strain that they found in Bruce Ivan's office. And there's been a fair amount of documentaries about Bruce Ivan. Bruce Ivan could be considered as a strange, eccentric guy. He had difficulty finding friends as a child, difficulty with creating relationships with women, and it seemed like he had a rather difficult adolescence, but he was very, very gifted in academics. By 2007, 2008, he was married. He had a family, but the FBI really believed that he was the suspect. They built a circumstantial case around him, mainly pertaining that he did some really bizarre things, like break into a sorority house. He would send weird packages, go on weird long drives. But it's important to point out that many of Bruce Ivan's colleagues don't believe he was the anthrax killer and feel that the FBI's claim of the strain matched. There's reasonable explanations with that. They believe that it would have been easy to transport between labs, from my understanding, the specific anthrax strain you were working on. And they personally just don't see him being as a killer. Also, the motive for him to do this is not very strong, it appears. They claim that the proposes the idea that Bruce Ivan had a anthrax vaccine, and if the attacks, I guess it's assumed that if there was an increased amount of anthrax attacks, it could have made and a vaccine needed to be developed. They could have used his patent, and I guess he could have became exorbitantly wealthy. But it's believed that many of Bruce's colleagues didn't believe he would be capable of that, or even the patent would lead to him making millions and millions of dollars. Eventually, the FBI basically made the claim that Bruce Ivan was the anthrax killer, and in 2008, Bruce Ivan committed suicide. It's largely believed that Dr. Bruce Ivan committed suicide. The pressure the FBI gave him in associating with him with the anthrax attacks. And that kind of ended the case. The FBI believes that he was the guy that was the anthrax killer, built on the bizarre behavior he had. Another thing to point out, his lab records were unusual. But some people in the scientific community feel that unusual hours are part of a scientist's lifestyle. But the FBI kind of points out that he had unusual high levels of activities right before the anthrax attacks. The scientific community, it feels, largely leans towards that's not a direct link, and scientists have unusual hours. Bruce Ivan, he committed suicide in the summer of 2008, and that's kind of all the leads, and that's kind of the end of all the leads in the case. The FBI largely believe he was the guy. We know Bruce's colleagues don't believe he was the person who committed these attacks, and at this case, the case has gone cold, and it's unlikely to ever be solved. It has appeared, though, in the last couple years that it's believed that maybe the terrorist element was is more likely to be correct. As the war on terror progressed, we found out Al-Qaeda was looking into anthrax attacks. Even when the 9/11 hijackers wanted to rent a crop duster plane and put anthrax in it, and that'd be a nightmare, obviously. But at this point, that's kind of all we have with the case. And Adam, the cases the FBI spent a lot of money on, this anthrax attack case is one of the highest amounts ever for the investigation. Who do you think caused the anthrax attacks? And if you want to hear more true crime content from YouTube's best amateur detective, subscribe to Crimeda today.